In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
A very warm welcome to you all. And my name is Jurgen Chonnevong, and I will be your moderator at this program. And this program is a very special episode from Stories from Nieuw-West. We started this series in new metropolis Nieuw-West. That's the satellite of Pakhuis de Zwijger in Nieuw-West. Because in times of corona, it's important to keep sharing stories. So we continued this series. And this next hour, we're going to talk about the exhibition on Gallery Mercatorplein by Johny Pitts called Afropean Express Travels in Black Europe. I'm very happy because he's here. He can join us through Zoom and we can talk with him about his intentions, about the meaning behind Afropean and how to move forward and to create an Afropean community internationally. Like I said, the Gallery Mercatorplein is an open-air gallery accessible without charge, and it's a project of foam and made possible by the municipality of Amsterdam, and to be specific, the West District. This edition takes place on the occasion on Forum on European Culture. We will talk with a wide array of guests, and I'm also very honored that they're here. Like I said, Johny Pitts, who took the initiative for the Afropean a research book exhibition, is here as well. But besides him, there's Fouad Lakbir. He's a storyteller from the Kolekit area. And in his work, he connects people through the art of telling stories. Fenna Olichki is a district administrator in the west part of Amsterdam. She calls herself a practical idealist. And she's responsible for a big list of themes in West. For instance, art, diversity and education. And she's also an avid lover of literature. We had many conversations about that, so I'm very much looking forward to see what she thinks about the Afropean identity and maybe position herself in that context as well. Angela Teller is an artist, photographer and writer. She gets her inspiration from people, situations, experience and nature. And she gives workshops at places like Rijksmuseum and Foam as well. And then I mentioned him before, Johny Pitts. He's a photographer and writer, and he developed the exhibition Afropean Express Travels in Black Europe. Well, let's get started. Johny, can I welcome you here virtually in our studio? Are you there?
I am here. Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here in such a strange time. I'm really honoured to be invited to talk about these photographs and to engage with the great artists and storytellers that you've also invited.
Yeah, it's a pity that you're not here, but to be in touch like this is very nice as well. Let's get started about the theme. What exactly is the concept of Afropean?
Well, I should know by now, shouldn't I? But actually, the more I write about it and think about it and get asked about it, it's almost like the less I know what it is in lots of ways. And I think in some ways, you know, that's the beauty of the term. For me, it was something that was like a heuristic. It was a portal into a way of looking at this continent that I call home. It was trying to explore the blur of cultures. The fact that I feel both of and not of Europe. And what I like about this term Afropean is that it's not mixed this or half that or black or that. It's whole and unhyphenated. And I like inserting the notion of blackness into the idea of Europe. That for me was really important. So that's how I use this term. The term actually, the history of it, it's quite a new portmanteau that was created by David Byrne from the Talking Heads. He was on tour with his band, very famous band, kind of do very alternative electronic music. And he was on tour with his band and noticed what he described as a reverse colonization. And there he met Marie Dong from a group called Zap Mama. And he loved her music. And it was this blurring, this mixture, this fusion of everything Belgian, but also everything Congolese. And together they used this term Afropean to describe the fusion in her music. I wanted to take it beyond music and beyond kind of things that involved, art direction and fashion photography. And I wanted to try and apply it to the streets of Europe. And so that's really where I began, is trying to think about how this term Afropean might work for people's lived experience, for everyday people.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this theory is that there's an equal part of different identities and different cultures combined. So it's not only the European culture that, gets a little spiced up by another culture, an African culture, of a culture from the African diaspora. It's equal. It's on equal footing. It's a mix of those two. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I don't want to deny any part of my heritage. And sometimes people think, oh, this book is about being a quote unquote mixed race, which is not the case at all. It's about feeling mixed cultured. It's about looking at different lineages and where they intersect. And so for me, I didn't want to deny any one part of my identity. But then at the same time, I didn't, I couldn't allow Europe to be oblivious about the parts of my identity that it didn't consider European. I needed to find a way to mix it all up and to describe a kind of blackness in Europe that, isn't going back anywhere anytime soon.
Can you give a couple of examples of what you consider to be Afropean?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, for one, I would say the port city of Marseille, which is where I've been living on and off until the coronavirus hit and we had to go into isolation and we wanted to be close to our family. But when I went to Marseille, here I saw a city that was as African as it is European. It was a place next to the Mediterranean. And I often say this, but I think it's really interesting how if you were to take Paris and Cairo, the two cities from Egypt and France, you would never confuse those two cities. These inland cities, you would never confuse them. However, if you take the cities from those two countries, Egypt and France, that are on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria and Marseille, you see this shared identity, this blurring of culture. And that really taps in, excuse me, I'm right on the Peckham Road here in London, so you might get a few sirens. But that really, to me, speaks of Paul Gilroy, the sociologist, his notion of the Black Atlantic, which asks us to look for identity, not just within the nation state, but within something that's more fluid. And he says the Atlantic Ocean. For me, Marseille was really symbolic of that.
Right. Just a question. Where are you at the moment? Because we heard the police sirens, so we all got a bit worried then. Where are you located at the moment?
Yeah, they're after me. No, I'm in Peckham in London, which for me is the kind of place actually that I was searching for all around Europe. You could liken Peckham to how maybe Belma used to be, at least the centre of Belma, to Rinkeby in Stockholm, to Chateau Rouge in Paris, and so Peckham is a real melting pot of different cultures from all over the world. It's very lively and it feels very London as well. Right. So that's where I'm broadcasting from right now.
And to be more specific as well, would you call Afropean more Brixton Road, or would you call Afropean more Edgware Road? So for people not familiar with the area, Brixton is more Afro-British, and Edgware Road is more Arabic British, you could say, to be, not to be specific, but just to get a gist of the idea. How would you define that?
I don't think it has to be either or. I think it can be both Brixton and Edgware, an Edgware Road. So for me, this is not something that I want to say you're in and you're out and you're from that part, so you can't talk about Afropean. For me, this is something that is fluid and it has to be defined by the community. And so if you live on Edgware Road and you're, let's say, like maybe a stereotype, I grew up in the Yemeni community, but say if you're Egyptian, perhaps, and you feel Afropean, or this term Afropean really resonates with your experience, then you could use it. It's not for me to say, no, it's more about people who are from the Caribbean in Brixton or vice versa. So for me, it has to be defined by the community.
But when it's not really clear, why is it really necessary to define it at all? Why give it a name, and why not just be? Creating a new label labels people, and I can imagine that that's not what you really want.
Yeah, well, I think that labels can be used. I mean, yeah, they are very often problematic and sometimes clumsy. But I think labels help you enter into into a world that sometimes is under or misrepresented. So for me, I noticed that Europe sometimes destroys by virtue of assimilation. The presence of black people in Europe isn't exported as part of the national packages in each individual European country in the same way that it is in a place like, say, the United States. For a lot of people, it always amazes me when I have my cousins come over from the States, they're African American, and they're like shocked that they see black people in Europe. So for me, Afropean is important as a kind of as something to build bridges, but also as a portal into a way of looking at Europe and complicating the notion of Europe. It's something that is constantly shifting. I would not want to make it monolithic, but I think it's important precisely in the same way that things like political blackness is important. It helps us work through ideas and try and challenge oversimplistic notions of national identity.
Yeah, but the people in the Netherlands especially say when it's connected to identity, if you create new identities and if you create what they call splinter identities, it's polarizing. It's not bringing people together. It's not it's no unison. It's polarizing. What would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that a word like Afropean is not it's exactly the opposite of that, isn't it? It's not trying to create anything that's separatist. This is something that where I'm trying to bring people together. I'm trying to build bridges, create connections, forge solidarities. So this is not something that I think Afropean is a word that is actually the opposite of what people might say. About being divisive. I don't think it is at all.
But what if I was a white person from the Netherlands and I would say Afropean excludes me because I'm white and I cannot be Afropean? What would you respond to that?
Well, I'd say that you are part of the story, are part of the Afropean story, and we have plenty of white people who've written for Afropean.com, and there are actually plenty of white people actually in the book that I speak to, and plenty of people that have really influenced and informed my ideas who are white. So I would say that if you feel that Afropean isn't for you, then that's fair enough. But it's certainly not. The doors aren't closed to you to open the discussion. I very much hope that I am talking to white people. For me, I wrote it for the black community in Europe, but for sure that white people aren't excluded from this conversation.
Right. I've got two short questions before we move on to Fenna. But the first one is, how does Afropean position itself to African American culture?
Well, I think that one of the virtues of this notion of African American culture is that it has created a presence and it created a civil rights movement. It was a unit and body of knowledge through which great thinkers could pass and join with each other and think through ideas. So in terms of it being a term that I think could be useful for joining people together, then it has a lot in common with this notion of being African American. And my father was African American. Where it differentiates itself is, I think it deals more with our post-colonial situation. It deals more with the fact that so many black people in Europe were taught and trained how to be European by European powers, so obviously Europe exported slavery and then, and America used that. But in terms of colonialism, I think there was definitely a big crossing of cultures that happened, and that needs to be thought through. I think on the one hand, I think it makes things very interesting when somebody even like me, but I think a lot of black people in Europe know Europe very intimately and feel like they are a part of Europe in one way, but then they're also, European is still used as a synonym for whiteness very often. So for me, I think that the big difference is the fact that there was a civil rights movement in the States. We never had a civil rights movement here in Europe, and also just colonialism and trying to think through the subtle ways that colonialism can create imbalances in the power structures all across the continent and the world.
Great, thank you. My final question before I move on to Fenna. Did you manage to see the exhibition on Mercatorplein yet?
I didn't. I've only seen pictures and videos of it, but I'm really amazed by it. In fact, this really working with, I should mention Kim Nobbers, I worked with very closely to put this exhibition together. We went through the whole archive of Afropean material. For me, it was beautiful because on the one hand, we had real care and attention for this work in an exhibition space, and foam is a beautiful exhibition space, and I'm really proud of that. On the other hand, we have the work leaving the gallery and going into the streets and democratized in a way, and so for me it was really beautiful to see this work up. If I had my way, what would happen is this work would be permanent. And I would stay Makataplein for like years. And over the years, graffiti artists...
Well, you know what? I've got the district administrator at the table at the moment. So I'll try and arrange that for you as we speak now. We will return to you a bit later. Thank you so much for now. But we will return to you a bit later. But joining me here at the table is Fenna Ulichki. Thank you so much for being here. All right, can we make a deal right now? Can it be there forever and ever and ever?
Als het mij ligt wel.
Yeah, Johny, we'll switch to Dutch now because I think that I can make things happen better, more quickly than in Dutch as well.
We can do business in Dutch.
Precies, fijn dat je er bent. Nee, het is natuurlijk eigenlijk heel bijzonder. We zien achter ons de beelden van hoe de expositie op Mercatorplein in is gedeeld. En fantastisch om dit beeld natuurlijk naar de openbare ruimte te brengen. Waarom heb je, want je hebt ontzettend hard gewerkt om dat te realiseren. Waarom heb je hard gemaakt om deze foto's daar in de open lucht te tonen?
Ja. Nou, allereerst, ik vind het ontroerend om het ook allemaal weer zo terug te zien. En de prachtige woorden ook van Johny Pitts, de auteur. En dank ook voor de uitnodiging om hier te komen zijn en te komen vertellen over wat we hebben gedaan. Misschien moeten we ook zeggen dat foam ook een belangrijke rol heeft gespeeld. Hè? Want die organiseren elk jaar met Nieuw-West jaarlijks terugkerend Galerie Mercatorplein. Vorig jaar was het Ahmed Polat. Ja, zeker. En nu Johny Pitts. Voor mij persoonlijk, toen ik het boek zag, Afropean, in de winkels, ik raakte gelijk verliefd op het verhaal. Op het boek, maar ook op de titel. Ik wist ook intuïtief gelijk waar het over ging. Zonder het boek te lezen, zonder ook echt helemaal erin te duiken, voelde ik het intuïtief. En ik dacht, gezien zeg maar de jaarlijks terugkerende Galerie Mercatorplein, die ruimte wil geven aan kunst in de openbare ruimte, met de buurt en voor de buurt. Het betrekken van jongeren, diversiteit en inclusiviteit en ook nieuwe perspectieven.
Ja, maar wat we nu horen, stel nou dat een lid van Forum voor Democratie hier aan tafel had gezeten, denk je, walgelijk politiek correct. Kunst en de openbare ruimte moet niet bezoedeld worden met dit soort politiek correcte nonsens. Ja.
Nou vind ik het goed dat Forum voor Democratie, dat ik ze niet wil zien als mijn referentiekader. Dat is niet de manier waarop ik mijn dag start. Nee, we hebben... Ik ben een kind van een gastarbeider. Dus ik ben de dochter van een gastarbeider. Ik kom uit een gezin van migratie. En ik heb als kind heb ik mij altijd enorm kunnen onderdompelen in het gegeven dat de reis die mijn ouders en al die gastarbeiders hebben gemaakt vanuit Marokko, maar het geldt ook voor andere landen, naar Nederland, maar ook België en Frankrijk. Het heeft mij als jonge vrouw altijd gefascineerd op basis van wat voor keuzes mensen hebben besloten om waar te zijn. En het heeft mij altijd geboeid hoe vervolgens na het vestigen die netwerken zich hebben ontwikkeld. En ook hoe die footprints, moeten we even noemen, de afdrukken van al die mensen overal nog zichtbaar zijn in het subtiele en in de straten en op de treinstations en de vluchthavens en weet ik het allemaal. En die footprints, die afdrukken, dat heeft mij altijd gefascineerd. En heeft ook altijd bij mij een soort van idee gegeven. Dit, als we het hebben over Europese identiteit, dan is dit is Europese identiteit.
Het is onderdeel geworden. Die migratiestromen zijn van oudsher natuurlijk altijd al onderdeel geweest van die Europese identiteit. Ja. Maar specifiek de trek die jouw familie, maar ook anderen hebben afgelegd in Nederland, maar ook in Europa. Die footprint, die moet herkend worden en erkend worden.
Die moet erkend worden en herkend worden omdat uitspraken als moslims zijn welkom in Nederland of waar dan ook in Europa, is echt zo 1980, 1990. Omdat we 60 jaar verder zijn en moslims zijn hier in dit land. En het is niet een kwestie van dat er een huisbaas is en die een kamer huurt aan een bepaalde groep. Maar men is hier in al haar diversiteit, in al haar energie en dynamiek, in al haar nuances en kleuren. En het is niet meer sprake van een gast en een huisbaas, maar een gegeven van mensen die hier zijn en die zich bewegen op de manieren zoals ze zich bewegen door heel Europa heen.
Wat interessant is inderdaad dat het niet meer gaat om welkom zijn of geen huurbaas. Want je zou eigenlijk kunnen zeggen dat Amsterdam inmiddels, dat heeft Maurice Krul van de VU onderzocht en ontdekt, bestaat uit verschillende groepen minderheden. Er is geen dominante meerderheid, in ieder geval niet in cijfers. Met dat in het achterhoofd zou je bijna zeggen, het is eigenlijk tijd om nu de nieuwe identiteit van Amsterdam te definiëren. Wie van de minderheden zorgt voor die ene dominante cultuur? Of moeten we samen een nieuwe cultuur creëren die dominant wordt? Hoe vind je daar die Afropean cultuur bij passen? Past die daarbij? Misschien wel helemaal niet.
Nou, op je eerste vraag, moet er een dominant narratief zijn of een dominante cultuur? En hoe verhoudt dus Afropean? Voor mij is Afropean is niet een identiteit. In de zin van, het is een identiteit, maar ik bedoel te zeggen, het is geen nationaliteit of een Europese label. Dus je gaat niet tegen iemand zeggen, hoi, ik ben Afropean. Dat is niet, denk ik, wat mensen
Waarom
zeggen.
niet eigenlijk? Want je zegt wel bijvoorbeeld African American.
Nee. Maar we kennen allemaal onze... Nou ja, goed, het zou kunnen. Het zou kunnen dat mensen met de tijd zullen zeggen, ik ben een Afropean. Maar wat mij fascineerde aan het verhaal van Johny Pitts is niet zozeer een nieuw label of een nieuw kader of een nieuw, zeg maar, hokje waar we mensen gaan indelen. Maar simpelweg een manier van denken. Simpelweg een manier van denken die je helpt om te kijken. Want wat ik heb gezien in zijn prachtige boek, die ik echt aanraad om te kopen. Het zijn feestdagen, dus als je een cadeautje wil, koop dat boek. Maar je ziet, eigenlijk je ziet beelden die vanzelfsprekend zijn. Je ziet beelden die heel normaal zijn. En dat zijn beelden die vergeten worden in het politieke discours. En dat zijn beelden van het gewone, het normale, de memorie, het geheugen. En dat we het dus niet meer hebben over nu en 5 jaar geleden en 10 jaar geleden. Jullie zijn welkom. Maar het feit dat we mensen hebben die gedurende 50 jaar lang, 60 jaar, 70, 80 jaar... Europa binnen zijn gestroomd, hun voetafdruk hebben achtergelaten, hun sporen hebben achtergelaten, straten hebben gevormd, culturen hebben gevormd. En dat maakt Europa wat het is en maakt Amsterdam ook wat het is. En als je de vraag stelt aan mij, is het niet tijd voor een dominant narratief of moet dat er niet komen, dan zou mijn antwoord denk ik daarop zijn. Ik denk dat het er zeker moet zijn en dan zou ik zeggen dat we het moeten hebben over de cultuur van democratie, solidariteit en rechtsstaat.
Ja, maar dat vind ik te algemeen.
Nee, dat snap ik dat je dat vindt, maar dat is wel mijn antwoord. Omdat ik namelijk vind dat ik vind het om nu te gaan spreken over een dominant narratief, terwijl wij allemaal met elkaar op zoek zijn naar een manier om elkaar te vinden en elkaar te ontmoeten en samen te leven, dan vind ik het ongemakkelijk om te gaan over te schakelen naar een soort van machtsverhouding, waarbij we het ene boven het andere plaatsen. Ja. Want daar lijkt het namelijk een beetje op. Als je zegt een dominant narratief, dan suggereer je daarmee in mijn beleving, maar dat zal je vast niet zo bedoelen, maar het suggereert wel in de algemene beleving dat er een dominant idee is, wat dus boven een ander idee staat.
Ik denk dat altijd, maar ik vind het ook interessant om dat aan Johny voor te leggen. Ik denk dat altijd een narratief ooit dominant zal zijn. Er zal altijd één verhaal zijn dat meer aanhang zal krijgen. Maar het is wel interessant ik ga mijn 2-trapsraket even aan Johny vragen. Johny, I'd like to ask something to you. I mean, Vanessa's very positive about your book, so that's really nice to hear. And she even plugged it as a present for Christmas, so that's really nice as well. But there's two questions that I would like to pose to you. And the first one is, should should politics take more notion of the Afropean identity in creating awareness about the structure of the cities? Because, like I said here in our conversation as well, in here in Amsterdam, but I believe in London as well, there's no dominant culture. At least in numbers, there's not anymore. There's minorities gathering together in a city. So if you take Afropean in account, and if politicians take Afropean in account, shouldn't be that the norm, or maybe the dominant narrative?
You know, I'm wary of putting myself in a position of talking about the political sphere. I have a lot of respect for the good politicians in this world, but I come from a generation that saw what happened with Tony Blair and New Labour in the United Kingdom, where we had a left-wing liberal, supposedly, prime minister, who then sort of co-opted this notion of multiculturalism and turned it into a kind of corporate version of multiculturalism, while at the same time undermining it, you know, saying that, the Home Secretary of Tony Blair was saying that, our schools are being swamped by asylum seekers. So that's happening on the one. On the other hand, when multiculturalism is good for big business, when it's good for the corporations, then it's championed. So for me, Afropean, the way I'm working through it, and other people can take it in other directions, who are more well-versed in certain arenas. But for me, I'm happy to keep it on the streets, to keep it in the cultural, which of course becomes political, but it's more of a kind of subaltern politics rather than something that, you'd find in the European Union. For me, Afropean is for the people, and which is why it's so great to see it in somewhere like Makaitoplein, where everyday people can just engage with it in that kind of capacity. In terms of it being debated in Parliament, that's not my place to put Afropean there.
But I do wonder, because you compared it to the African American culture, where it ignited almost the civil rights movement, and it got out of a niche. African American culture was not only for black people; it was something that should be taken into account everywhere and was politicized. If you don't take Afropean out of the niche context, it can never be politicized, and it can never become a movement that people will take notice of. Aren't you worried about that?
Yeah, no, I certainly don't think I don't see it as niche. And in fact, I think very much of what Toni Morrison once said, where she said, I stood at the periphery and claimed it as central. So for me, Afropean is at the heart of Europe, and it has to be. And what I'm trying to do is make Europe understand that, and understand its own legacy of colonialism, and understand that Africa, blackness, and the many communities that forged the black community in Europe as a whole, the diaspora, is absolutely intrinsic and is at the heart of Europe. That's what I'm trying to do. But I would say that, I wouldn't say that I'd connect it with the African American experience exactly. For me, if we're going to look at America, I would say it's more similar to something like the Harlem Renaissance. And what I love about the Harlem Renaissance is that it had a political backbone. You had Otto and Amina Hisvald, who the Black Archives in Amsterdam are unearthing their story and of how they fought for independence in Suriname and were part of the Communist Party in America before they came to Amsterdam, and how they then inspired Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, poets, and then you had music, you had dancing, you had a complete movement. It wasn't just politics. So for me, I'm operating within this cultural sphere. I'm a photographer, I'm a writer. I would try to make a book in Afropean that was well written, that was beautiful. And of course, there's a political element to that. And there are people who can take Afropean in a more political way, in a better way than I can. But I certainly don't think I don't see Afropean as being niche and in some enclave. For me, it's at the heart of the European project, and which is why I think it's the book has been translated and captured people's imaginations, because I think people know that, and it's about time we tell our stories. And of course, people like Gloria Vecca have long been telling this story, but I'm just trying to bring it into the light.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a very important story that you just mentioned, Otto and Hermina Huiswoud, that the Black Archives unearthed is really a story that should be taken in account. Thank you so much. I'm joined here at the table by two more guests, so I'd like to continue our conversation with them and with you as well. But like I said, Voort Lakbier, who's a storyteller from the Koninklijke, joined us here as well. So a warm welcome to you. And Angela de Leer, and you're an artist, a photographer and a writer. What's your involvement in the project, Angela, when we talk about the exhibition on MacArthurplein?
Well, the Faux Museum asked me to work together with the curator Kim Knoppers to moderate a project with some kids that work together with Voort. And my partition in the project was I gave them a tour, and I basically tried to stimulate them in trying to see the photographs differently. So normally when you go to a museum, people would look at a photograph for maybe 7 seconds and then they would continue to the next photograph. And I really wanted them to explore Johnny's story by moving them in the right direction without telling too much. And there were a lot of interesting topics that came up during the tour.
Am I correct in noting that that the conversation that you had influenced the selection of pictures that ended up at the square as well? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So I asked the group to go through the exhibition for a certain amount of time, maybe 5 minutes, and I asked them to pick one picture, which was hard because there were a lot of beautiful, great pictures. And everybody picked one picture, and then we discussed the photographs. And then we made a broad selection, and they were with, I believe, 5 or 6 of them. And they had to work together, of course. And they had different interpretations of the project. And some of them could, not quite identify with the project, but maybe they knew someone that could identify with the project. For example, earlier there was a picture of 2 graduates in front of a big flat. And the girl pointed out that picture, that one. And she said, this is very interesting because this is not a narrative that you see very often, because it's 2 black men who graduated in front of a big flat, which suggests that it's, not in a city center. And she thought it was very interesting and important that those images were also being seen. So she picked one of those.
But isn't it sad at the same time? I mean,
it is.
The fact that this is a unique picture that's not very common is very saddening, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not unique to a bigger audience. It's the people who, my family, friends, the people portrayed on the picture. For them, the photographs are all over the place. But in a wider audience, museums or the public space, I think those narratives should be shown way more often.
Absolutely. Yeah. Johnny, what did you think about the selection of pictures? Did you agree with it, or was it surprising to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult for me because they're all my babies, So I'm very, to me, they're all important, and it was very interesting working with Kim in terms of how we chose images that sometimes were on the periphery of the collection. They weren't the images that I thought had the decisive moment, but they captured a mood. And I think of that saying, don't show me how things look, show me how things feel. And I feel like what I love about this selection is that it connects with how these young people felt. I mean, I read some of the text that was written, the responses that the young people had to these images, and I was just blown away by how poetic and how insightful and how generous the quotes were. And I found it very touching, actually. And for me, I have absolutely no problem with the selection that they made. It looks great. My only regret is that I can't see it in the person.
All right. Well, maybe we'll just get across the border silently. We won't tell anybody. Voort, you've worked with the young people as well. How do you identify, or what do you consider to be Afropean? Do you identify yourself as being Afropean or not?
Well, when Foam told me about this exposition, the first thing I thought was, yes, I like the idea that we are having an exposition on MacArthurplein, a square which I visit actually daily for my cup of coffee or some nuts, which I buy a lot at that square. And it's actually next to my house, so it's a square where I grew up. And then actually I saw, let me think very well. Yeah, I saw first the selection on Mercatorplein, and after it I visited the selection in Foam itself. And I remember going there alone with music on because I wanted first to see just the pictures. I didn't want to listen to the stories behind the pictures, because they put some barcodes on the square where you can listen to the voice of Johny or to the voice of the young people. And I just went through the pictures, and actually what happened to me, the pictures brought me back to just memories of me clubbing, me going to Paris and watching the guy playing soccer, pictures which I know. And at some point I read the piece about Afropean, and then at some point I thought, hey, somehow I recognize myself in the people, but more in the sense of they are in their daily doing things. They are just random people for me. And then I thought, hey, why are they all just black? While the term Afropean for me was a term of, I consider myself also African. My roots are in Morocco. And I expected also to feel the way I feel when I walk through Amsterdam or when I walk through Europe. I went to Paris, I went to London. For example, when I go to London and I walk through Edgware Road, I just blend in there and I don't even think. I just participate. I am just Fouad. And there I got this error of, hey, I recognize myself in the story of Johny, because I went also through this journey of searching for my identity. What is my story? What is my place in Europe? And when I moved through Amsterdam, I moved through the West, through Nieuw-West, through Southeast, and the way I recognize myself is through the blend of different identities, and that makes for me this thing which I would consider Afropean.
Yeah.
And actually, when I went to the square and when I went also to Foam, I loved it. But at the same time, I had this question of, do I belong in this story? And I actually had always this question, and that's where it stayed for me.
Yeah, Johny, that's something quite interesting that Fouad brings up here, is that, I mean, the theory of Afropean is very inclusive, and how you explained it as well, but imagery is important as well. So in the imagery, is it already inclusive enough, or should we focus more on a broader representation of everybody in that sense? What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, there are many narratives. I'm trying to think of all the images in the Foam exhibition, but there are people in that exhibition who are Moroccan and Algerian. What in France, is described as Maghreb. There are many narratives, especially within the book. I mean, I actually begin the whole book in Sheffield with my Yemeni next door neighbours, and I include the Yemeni narrative within the Afropean context. And then I go to places like Rinkeby, which I believe is 80% Muslim, and not to racialize the term Muslim, but which is home to a lot of Tunisian community and Turkish communities. And I include that, I suppose, but I think it's a good question. I think, when people think of Africa, they have an idea about what African is. Of course, Africa is a continent. It's not a country. Or as somebody said to me recently, actually, Africa is the world. But when people think of Africa, they have a certain idea. But the largest country in Africa is Algeria. And that ties me back. And again, I mentioned this with the Algerian War of Independence, and also how Algeria was traditionally a place of what might have been described as a kind of bastion of third world politics. You had the Black Panthers going to Algeria. I mean, the Battle of Algiers is one of the most important movies for people who are fighting against oppression. So I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's a really complicated one. And I think what I would say to Fouad is that if he feels Afropean, then I would encourage him to really adopt Afropean, because I think that it's so key that the issues that that communities who are traditionally Muslim are facing is woven into this the kind of cultural moment that I'm trying to create with Afropean. I suppose I didn't go into it as much as I could have, because I'm not Muslim, and I feel like maybe somebody else could take it there. In the same way that I think I could have dealt with sexual politics more, feminism actually more, even though these strands are in the book very often. For me, I think that these are strands of Afropean that perhaps it's on other people to develop more. And one thing that I say in the book is that if Afropean resonates with you, you have to get in touch with us at afropean.com and write a story for us and take it in the direction that you want to take it. This was my personal journey, and I was searching for home. And so very often, I suppose, I was anchoring myself to places that felt the most like home. But certainly for me, the way Fawad speaks about his identity growing up, and the certain places where you go to shop, like in Firth Park, where I grew up, the certain places where you go, there are these shops that are independent and sell a certain kind of produce. And I know that Fawad recognises those places. And that for me is as Afropean as anywhere else.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's important to be inclusive and to be aware of people feeling part and maybe not represented at the moment, but it's interesting to see what steps that could be taken to be more inclusive. And at the same time, I wonder, there's always somebody you will, not include, not intentionally, but it's a very broad term. So it's really, what I think is interesting is that you give it almost to the world in order to define it and to create a life of itself. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very new term, and it's, I think very often on my generation, and I'm quoting the scholar Paul Gilroy here, that there was a war on the imagination of our generation. There was the death of communism, and then Francis Fukuyama's talking about the end of history, where Western liberal democracy is the only vision for the future. And it just meant that if you were trying to construct any other kind of politics, you were kind of laughed at. And so for me, Afropean is very new and it's very forward thinking. Some might even say it's utopian.
No.
But I'm just very wary of trying to identify it too much, trying to nail it down to something too much, because I think that is actually what is happening with nationalism and populism. Yeah. Saying you are British and this is what British is, or whatever. And
we should be wary. We should be wary of that. Angela, what's quite interesting as well is that at the same time that Johny started to researching and developing his ideas about Afropean identity, you created something that's called Afropolitans. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, when I graduated, I stumbled on this term Afropolitan, which comes from the word Africa and cosmopolitan, meaning world, a citizen of the world. And I thought it was very interesting because it's the first time that I could identify with something positive going for Black people. And I started looking for images. As a photographer, of course, I started looking for images of Afropolitans, and all I could find were just images of fashion, fabrics, just the typical cliche images of Africa. And then I decided, well, I'm a photographer, so I'm just going to go out in the world and see people who identify with this term. So I could identify myself, but also my friends and friends of friends. And I shot it on Polaroids because I was aware that even though I could identify with this, subculture, I'll call it, it was not about me. I wanted to show people the way they wanted to be seen to the world. So Polaroid is something that narrows it down because when it's shot, I cannot change anything about it. And I asked people to pose however they wanted to pose because again, I wanted to show the world how they wanted to be seen. So, and I'm still working on the series. It's an ongoing series, and I'm not even sure if it's going to end anytime soon because I feel that the whole diaspora and the cultural mixture, it evolves continuously. So,
are there any parallels between Afropolitans and Afropean?
I think there are. For me, Afropolitan is about new generations owning and taking place, like Fenna said, Arabic people have been here for over 60 years. So you are Dutch, you are European. And for me, it's like owning that and taking that place. And I just wanted to make it visible.
And not only 60 years, but even longer. If you go back in history, it's the representation of Arabic people, but people from all different kinds of cultures. I did a project called Dutch Masters Revisited, which which saw people in the 17th and 18th century from all over the world already in Amsterdam. Fenna, there's a question I want to ask you as well. Het is interessant om het over die Afropean identiteit te hebben. En tegelijkertijd denk ik, want ik ben van knuppels in hoenderhokken gooien en ik gooi ze graag jouw richting op. Is het niet een klein beetje geforceerd? Al die overeenkomsten die we een soort lappendeken die je samen wil stellen. Laten we een beetje trots zijn op onze eigen identiteit. Er hoeft er geen paraplu-term overheen te komen, toch?
Je bedoelt de term Afropean als een paraplu-term, ja. Nou ja, wat ik net heb geprobeerd uit te leggen in ieder geval is dat... Kijk, pluriformiteit is een gegeven. Misschien sterker nog, het is iets wat we moeten willen koesteren. Het is geen gegeven. Het is geen cadeautje. Je moet er altijd hard voor vechten. Het is namelijk een onderdeel van wat je als democratische staat wil zijn. En daar hoort pluriformiteit bij. Dus pluriforme culturele diversiteit van een stad. Dat betekent dus dat die verscheidenheid, die rijkdom en die lagen die we hebben, of dat nou is in etnische achtergrond of religieuze achtergrond of gender, speelt zich ook af in termen van historisch perspectief. En is dus nogmaals niet iets van gisteren, maar is iets van heel lang geleden. En het vormt dus, daarom vind ik het idee, zeg ik ook bewust, van Afropean heel bijzonder. Omdat het namelijk ook perspectieven creëert voor een toekomst die niet gaat over grenzen en barrières en Forum Europa. Maar eerder een Europa die staat voor een rijkdom aan culturele ontwikkelingen, energie en dynamiek. Als Europa dat niet heeft, dan staan we stil. En als we stilstaan, dan is er decadentie. En als je decadent wordt, dan verval je als continent. En Europa heeft alleen maar kunnen bestaan door elke keer weer die vernieuwing die er is en die zuurstof die gegeven wordt aan Europa in haar culturele vorming. En als je dus, toen ik het boek nogmaals zag, dacht ik, dat hele betoog wat ik nu houd, is er één wat misschien niet heel populair is, een grote bekkenland, hè, zeg maar. Dus daar waar de grote bekken en het geschreeuw en wij moeten ons allemaal aanpassen aan een bepaalde identiteit en cultuur, daar past dit niet bij. Maar dat is niet mijn referentiekader. Want mijn referentiekader is de werkelijkheid. Ja. En de werkelijkheid is er een die je onder andere ziet in de foto's die Johny Pitts heeft laten zien. Namelijk het normale, het gewone, het alledaagse.
Ik ben het met je eens, maar toch ga ik je proberen van het idee af te brengen. Want luister, jij met je Marokkaanse identiteit en ik met mijn Surinaamse identiteit. Het is leuk, we kunnen het goed vinden met elkaar, maar we lijken toch eigenlijk helemaal niet qua achtergrond. Niks lijkt op elkaar.
Dat ben ik niet met je eens. Ik heb zoveel verbanden met jou. Ik voel zoveel liefde.
Die is wederzijds, maar daar hebben we in het programma niks aan.
There's so much love between us.
Nee, maar wat zijn dan die verbanden?
Die verbanden zijn is dat wij, jij en ik en alle andere mensen aan tafel, het geldt over voor de Fransen, is dat wij Amsterdammer zijn. En dat wij liefde hebben voor deze stad. En dat we liefde hebben voor de stedelijke cultuur die we met elkaar hebben opgebouwd. En dat we elkaar, wat Johny Pitts net prachtig zei. Toni Morrison stond aan de rand en noemden dat haar centrum. Wij hebben ook komen wij vanuit een bepaalde rand en hebben het ons centrum genoemd. Dus elke keer, we hebben een half woord nodig om elkaar te vinden en te snappen. Ik heb maar een half woord nodig richting vooruit. En hij begrijpt precies waar ik het over heb. Dus wij hebben al die centra die zich hebben gevormd aan de randen van de ontwikkeling van deze stad, zijn nu de stad. En dat maakt het zo mooi. En daarom hebben wij, jij en ik, om maar een voorbeeld te noemen, hebben heel veel met elkaar. Sterker nog, ik heb misschien wel meer met jou dan met mijn eigen vader op sommige momenten.
Hoezo dat?
Nou ja, dat lijkt me heel normaal. Ik denk dat jij misschien ook wel eens meer met mij hebt dan met andere mensen die van dezelfde etnische achtergrond zijn. Dus omdat we een leefstijl hebben, omdat we een bepaalde ontwikkeling hebben doorgemaakt, omdat we een bepaalde vorm van activisme delen met elkaar, omdat we gaan voor solidariteit en voor liefde, radicale liefde, omdat we we oog hebben voor schoonheid. En dat we je cultuur willen brengen. Omdat je mooie exposities maakt en ik graag kom kijken. En dat is de relatie die we hebben. En dat maakt ons wat we zijn. En ja, de uitspraak, nogmaals, ik vind hem echt prachtig. Ik ga hem laten graveren. Maar ik stond aan de rand en ik noemde dat het centrum. Ja.
Johnny, I was trying to get Fenna to get rid of the Afropean umbrella term. I was not very successful at that. so we're stuck with it, which I'm very happy with. Time is running out, so I have to look at the future as well. What are your next steps? What can we expect from you in future?
We're currently working on a podcast for Afropean, because what I'm keen to do is reach people who may not be readers or may not be able to even afford to buy the book, and to get a podcast out there which almost works in the kind of oral tradition that the diaspora has used. So there'll be a podcast. There's also possibly a documentary that we're working with, and perhaps even touring this collection of images all around Europe and beyond. But then the next book that I'm working on is something that will be dealing more in a kind of more abstract way with the legacy of colonialism, and I'm taking it in quite a different direction actually. But it is intimately connected with the work that I'm doing now. But I can't speak too much about it.
Oh, right. You make us very curious. What's the abstract interpretation of colonialism? Give us something. You can't leave us hanging like this.
What I will say is I had a moment when I was a child in 1990 in Japan during the bubble economy years. So I grew up in a working class part of Sheffield. Then my dad got this job in Japan for this period of time where I had the best time of my life. But this moment in Japan's history, which was the bubble economy, where it looked like Japan was going to rule the world, is now it's a really problematic moment. So what I'm trying to do, I would say, is if I'm trying to look at moments where I was a part of something that was problematic and try and work through that. It sounds very odd at the moment, but what I would say is that if Afropean was about somehow trying to reconcile races, I would say that the new project is about trying to reconcile generations.
Right. I'm very much looking forward to that. That's another question I'd like to pose, with future in mind, because here at this table, and you and I, we are in agreement of what Afropean is and why it is important. At the same time, here in Amsterdam, I don't know whether you heard of it, the Black Archives, a mural there was attacked. Black icons, were painted over, and it was terribly damaged and maybe permanently damaged. That means that, the consensus that we have about diversity, about inclusion, isn't shared very commonly in the Netherlands or even in Amsterdam. And I'm going to pose a question to you here at the table as well, but what do you think that the next steps are going to be? Because we now are preaching to the choir. How can we change the momentum and make it, broadly accepted?
That's a tough question. I wish I had the answer to that. I'm astonished with the work that the Black Archives are doing, because they're doing cultural work, but they're actually really on the front line of trying to make a change. And I think it's really interesting in how they try and tackle something like Black Pete in a non-violent way, and then the systemic violence rears its head, and I think they're raising really important questions about identity in the Netherlands, but also across Europe. So I'm very inspired by their work. I think we just have to keep going. I think now is the moment where it seems like everything's up for grabs, and everything seems to be getting worse at the same time it seems to be getting better. There are these chances for us, the Black consciousness. We haven't seen this kind of Black consciousness in the public domain for maybe 30, 40 years. So I think we've got a lot to fight against, but it's been done before, and resistance movements have won. So I think it's just all for grabs. And in that moment, as scary as it is, I think it's also an exciting moment for us to try and redefine forever what Europe is.
Fenna, ik kijk ook even naar jou deze avond. Je bent een bestuurder namens de gemeente Amsterdam. Dat dit in deze stad gebeurt, het zou ons niet moeten verbazen natuurlijk, maar het verbaast me wel. Wat zijn de stappen die we kunnen nemen? Hoe sta jij erin?
Nou ja, we zijn om te beginnen allemaal vreselijk geschrokken. En we hopen ook echt dat de daden zo snel mogelijk opgepakt worden. Het begint ook echt met het veroordelen. Echt met klem veroordelen van wat hier gebeurt. En het ook echt in de ruime bewoordingen. En een norm stellen. Dat betekent dat je moet normstellend zijn als overheid. Je moet aangeven, dit is onacceptabel wat hier gebeurd is. En tegelijkertijd, wat Johny zegt, vind ik heel bijzonder, is tegelijkertijd zie ik dus ook de reactie. Dit is dus de reactie op ontwikkelingen die gaande zijn in de stad. Overigens, die we moeten veroordelen. Gaan we stotteren? Kun je nagaan hoeveel ik wil vertellen. Maar we moeten het dus veroordelen. Maar daarnaast wil ik zeggen, het is een reactie op een beweging die we in de stad zien, in Amsterdam zien, die alleen maar die kant op gaat. Namelijk een stad waar solidariteit is. En waar diversiteit de norm is. En antiracisme, waar we allemaal antiracisten zijn. Waar het geen hobby is van een paar, maar het raakt ons allemaal. Er is er ook geen sprake van both sides. Van, nou ja, mensen hebben een probleem met Zwarte Piet, want ze hebben zijn daarmee een feestje kwijtgeraakt. Nee, dit is niet een kwestie van both sides. Dit is gewoon een pure daad van een racistische daad, die je ook niet op een andere manier moet beschrijven, maar als puur racisme. En ik hoop echt dat de daden zo snel mogelijk opgepakt worden.
And you guys, I mean, isn't it so discouraging that you think that you take, a couple of steps in the right direction and then you get hit back so hard again, and where you have the feeling that nothing has changed? Do you share that sentiment or not? Angela?
A little bit both. I think the fact that it happens, that tells us that we are moving fast in the right direction. I believe that education is key. I think that we should teach more in schools, and we need to learn, but we also need to unlearn a lot of things in order to come together and grow. So it's very sad, and I'm very disgusted by what happened, but it also tells me that we're getting closer to a better future.
For what, are we really getting closer to a better future, or is that something that we just try and tell ourselves in order to keep the courage?
So when I saw this thing which happened with the black archives in the newspaper, I was also in shock, and I was like, wow, why? But at the same time, I talked since that moment a lot with friends, and there was one friend of mine who remembered me of the steps we took the past years. He said his parents used really to be celebrating Santa Claus with Black Pete to make really a statement in the family. Even though they had this discussion in the family, they always said, if you don't want to celebrate it with us with Black Pete, stay away. That was their statement. And this year, their statement was, no, we won't celebrate it with Black Pete this year. And they live really far from the big city. And what I see in Amsterdam right now is if I walk through the streets of only the west of Amsterdam, for example, where I live, it's filled with murals. My neighborhood is filled with murals where I recognize my story at the moment. And it's filled with projects and opportunities to tell our story. For example, in our district, we have this fund which actually is initiated by FENA, which is about telling your stories. Tell us the untold stories, so we claim more space. And actually, what I feel right now in the city, even though this still happens, I think the group which takes this kind of initiatives is getting smaller and smaller, and the group who gets together is growing and growing. That's what I feel actually in the city.
Great. It's good to hear, and it's good to end on a very hopeful note, because I do see change, and sometimes I do get discouraged about the setbacks that we have. We didn't have any time to talk about the Woord van West or the murals that are created. Hopefully there's an opportunity next time to talk about more about that, and to talk about the power of stories, the power of words, because that can change attitudes, that can change ideas, and sometimes that then create new identities. For now, I have to close off already. So, Johny, I have to say goodbye to you. Thank you so much for your book. Thank you so much for your research, and thank you for collaborating in this program. And thank you for sharing your insights. I hope this is a continuous conversation, so I won't say goodbye to you, but I say to the next time when we meet again, and then we can further our conversation. Hopefully that will be in Amsterdam, because we'd like to welcome you here. And hopefully this exhibition will not be the last. So thank you so much, and see you again soon. Oh my God, your sound is off.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for engaging with this work and helping to bring this to the light and speaking with me today. It's been a real honor, and I do hope we can continue the conversation into next year.
Great, let's do that. Thank you all. Thank you to our guests here at the table. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Fenna. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us here and watching the program. If you'd like to know more about the programs of Pak uit de Zwijger, please go to the website www.dezwijger.nl. And if you would like to make a contribution financially, that is also possible in these challenging times. Go to dezwijger.nl/pay. There you can make a contribution that will benefit the programs directly. If you would like to know about more about the programs that are coming up, check the website, check the program, and then I'll hope to see you at another program. Thank you so much. Thank you. See you next time. Bye-bye.